thank you for all being here. I'm Jim Klein. I'm president of American Benefits Council, and want to echo the words of our chair, Allison, and my colleague, Jason, in saying how delighted that we are that you're all here. We actually, we're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is the first time in our 50 years, I think, that's happened. So I'd like to invite anybody who may be in the back and crowded to take some of the empty seats that are up here in the front. And since we're going to be editing the filming, when we send it out, we can cut out the minute or so that it might take for people to move up front if anybody is so inclined to have a little bit more comfort and room to spread out. As y'all are doing that, I want to open up this session and say how pleased we are to have with us Dave Walker. I don't know that there is any American who has ever held as many senior roles in the government related in one fashion or another to employee benefits. Dave was executive director of the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. He was the assistant secretary of labor for the what is now the Employee Benefits Security Administration. He served for many years as a public trustee of the Social Security and Medicare program, and then a very distinguished career for a number of years as Comptroller General of the United States, which has a much broader portfolio, but it certainly includes review and analysis and recommendations around employee benefit programs. In keeping with his interest in public service, today he is a candidate for the Republican nomination for governor of Connecticut, and that's just his public sector service. He had a very, very distinguished career in the private sector, including, we are very proud to say, as a long-serving member of the board of directors of American Benefits Council. So, Dave, thank you very much for being here and really for all your years of service, which cross over not all, but many of the years of the American Benefits Council. You know, the theme today is the future of employee benefits. So let's just start out with a general question, if we may, in terms of, you know, what do you see in terms of that future, and maybe any reflections on some of these interesting poll results that we just heard about?
Well, Jim, first let me thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It's great to be at the center of the employee benefits universe on the 50th anniversary, golden anniversary of ABC. You know, really appreciate the opportunity to reconnect with a lot of friends last evening and today. Appreciate that very much. Look, my general philosophy is you have to learn from the past and focus on the future. And that's what you're trying to do here in this session. If you don't learn from history, you're destined to make some of the same mistakes. But on the other hand, we have to focus on not just where we are, but where are we headed and what's going to change. And I think of several things there. One, many people have said demographics are destiny, and that's really true. So if you look at some macro demographic trends, you look at millennials versus boomers. Millennials are now the biggest generation. Boomers are no longer the biggest generation. Their desires, needs, wants, mobility, and a variety of other factors are very different than baby boomers, okay? You see some of that in the responses to the questions. Lifespans obviously are getting longer. There are growing gaps between the haves and the have-nots. It's not just income and wealth, it's also education, things of that nature. We have increasing diversity. This is a country of immigrants and the most diverse country on earth. We've got a very big change in the poverty rate. It used to be that the highest incidence of poverty in the United States was seniors. That's no longer the case. In fact, in some studies, it's the lowest incidence of poverty. The highest incidence of poverty in the United States is children, and children represent our future. You take that combined with fiscal challenges. The federal government has grown too big, promised too much, needs to restructure. Debt to GDP is too high. It's headed on a course to break all-time records at the end of World War II. That's imprudent, that's unethical, that's immoral, and it needs to change. Many states have serious financial challenges. If you live in New Jersey, Kentucky, Illinois, or Connecticut, you are in serious trouble. And I live in Connecticut. And by the way, 70 to 80% of the financial challenge associated with those states are underfunded pensions and unfunded retiree health care benefits. They have to be restructured in a fair, equitable, and sustainable fashion. It is not an option, it is an imperative, and it's one of the reasons that I'm running. And then when you think all of that, you know, you've obviously got retirement income needs, you obviously have health care needs, but you also have long-term care needs. And that still is a very big issue. It's really not a health care issue. It's much broader than a health care issue. It's something that could be planned for. It's something that could be saved for. It's something that you might be able to provide some insurability against. But that's a really big issue that I don't think we've really come to grips with yet. So those would be a few preliminary thoughts on that.
So thanks. So, you hinted at this a little bit more, and you've really been a very longstanding and articulate voice on the concern around our growing federal debt. But, the economy seems to be humming along pretty well. This week, the Senate is poised to pass a bill that will add another $1.5 trillion. Are the concerns overstated? And, you were a trustee of Social Security and Medicare. I mean, if the concerns are not overstated, what's going to happen in the day of reckoning here?
Well, first, I do not believe there is a party of fiscal responsibility in America today. I believe that both political parties have been irresponsible, and for varying reasons. I don't get overly concerned about deficits per se or debt per se. What I focus on like a laser is debt as a percentage of the economy. During most of the history of the United States, debt as a percentage of the economy, I'm talking about public debt, was in the 35 to 40% range. Even during the Great Depression, even at the end of the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, it was 35 to 40%. The highest it ever was 105 at the end of World War II for understandable reasons. We were betting the ranch. But then it went back down to about 35% by 1980, but we've lost control. Now, it's at about 80% and climbing, and that's imprudent. We need to do something about it. My view is that we need to rechange our entire fiscal policy to focus on debt to GDP. That includes getting rid of the debt ceiling limit. It's dumb. It hasn't worked. What we need to do is have specific targets and triggers and enforcement mechanisms that say we want to get debt to GDP from about 80% now down to about 65 by, let's say, 2040, with specific targets, triggers, and enforcement mechanisms. It's kind of the Missouri principle. You think this is going to pay for itself? Show me. If it does, fine. If it doesn't, there are things that are going to happen in order to make sure that we don't spin out of control. I started speaking out loudly when I was Comptroller General of the United States in 2003 because three things happened that year that showed me that things were out of control. Second round of tax cuts that were debt financed. We couldn't afford them. They didn't pay for themselves. Invaded a sovereign nation without declaring war, Iraq. My son fought as a Marine Corps officer there. Unfortunately, he's okay. And thirdly, expanded Medicare to add prescription drugs, added $8 trillion in new unfunded obligations when it was already underfunded 19. Look, we have to change our metrics. Metrics matter. Not all tax cuts pay for themselves. Not all spending, not all debt is bad. Not all spending is bad. But we got to separate the wheat from the chaff, and we need to do it soon.
So in that regard, employee benefits represent the largest tax expenditures in the entire federal budget. Health and retirement are number 1 and 2. According to, each of the government agencies calculates it a little bit different, but they're all basically in the same range. According to Office of Management and Budget, the tax expenditure, the projected lost tax revenue over the next 10 years for health care is $2.9 trillion. For retirement, employer-sponsored retirement plans, $1.6 trillion. Is the tax expenditure worth it?
Well, in 2012, I did something unusual. I went on a 10,000-mile, 27-state fiscal responsibility tour to actually engage with the American people about the facts, the truth, the tough choices, and what do we need to do to put our finances in order to get debt to GDP down. And two of the areas that I talked about were obviously, several areas: taxes, employee benefits, Social Security, Medicare, a variety of different things. Here's the bottom line on that. The American people felt very strongly, and I agree, that we want to maintain tax preferences for retirement income. Savings rate is still too low. Coverage is still inadequate, I might add, okay, with regard to retirement income plans. And so I think it's very important we do that, and I don't think we ought to be doing more of this well, gee, won't give you a tax preference today, but you'll be tax-free tomorrow, because that's mortgaging our future again. I mean, and that's just game playing as far as I'm concerned. On the other side, with regard to health care benefits, I believe, and 82% of the people, of the representative group of Americans that I dealt with in a meaningful exchange for half a day in Ohio and Virginia, on this bus tour, but it was a representative group of Americans, demographically representative. 82% as part of a health care reform believed that people ought to be taxed on the value of their health care benefits in excess of a certain amount. So in other words, let's define what basic and essential health care is. Basic and essential health care for everybody is preventative, wellness, and catastrophic protection. That is a broad-based societal need that we should figure out a way to meet. We can afford it, we can sustain it. If you want more than that, it's a want, all right? If somehow you're going to get more than that through your employer, fine, but you ought to pay taxes on it. It's called compensation. It's called compensation. And I think it's one of the reasons why healthcare costs get fueled. And if you ask these questions, you also need to ask them, well, gee, if this was taxable, would you feel any differently about it? Because when you get a tax-free benefit, that's different than if it's a taxable benefit. In addition, a lot of people don't understand that the fastest growing cost in compensation is health care, which means you're holding down the ability to do other things, including wage increases. It's just math. I mean, it's not that complicated. By the way, that's the new four-letter word in fiscal policy, math. Yeah.
Well, apparently those 82% were not among those who we polled.
Well, but here's the problem. Here's the problem. One of the reasons I did this tour is because polling can be very simplistic. For example, if you ask the American people, do you want to pay higher taxes? Would you like to work longer before you're eligible for Social Security? Do you want to pay a higher premium for Medicare? What the hell do you expect them to say, right? What you have to do is you have to build the burning platform. You have to help them understand that we're on an imprudent and unsustainable path that threatens our country's future and our family's future. We have no choice but to make tough choices. And then you have to get them to agree on what the goal should be, what the principles and values are that will bring people together rather than divide them apart. That's what we did. We got over 90% agreement on those two things. And then we started saying, okay, should we do on taxes? What should we do on Social Security? What should we do on Medicare? What should we do on health care? What should we do on defense? What should we do, in political reforms, et cetera? That's how you get things done. And we got 77 to 97% agreement on a broad range of reforms that would get debt to GDP down to where we need to be and be on a path to sustain it there. That's what you need to do. That's leadership. And that's the biggest deficit in this country. Leadership.
Probably find a lot of agreement around that conclusion.
We'll do a poll on it.
Yeah. Well, you know what they say, 42.7% of all statistics are made up on the spot, So let's switch gears just a little bit. In both your private sector and your public sector work, you had a lot of opportunity to be involved with, to observe, to be engaged with employee benefit programs and human resources more broadly. So what would be your take on what the future role of private sector employer-sponsored benefits needs to be around all of this? You've shared a lot of valuable perspectives around the debt and around public systems.
Yeah. Well, our coverage rate with regard to pensions is still at about 50%, which is inadequate. And my personal view is that we're never going to get the amount of retirement savings that we need unless there is some form of automatic savings. I'm not saying mandatory. I use the word automatic because it's more palatable than mandatory. And in fact, when we ended up doing Social Security reform proposals, we talked about what do we need to do to make sure that the base defined benefit is solvent, sustainable, secure indefinitely, given known demographic trends, all right? But in addition to that, what do we need to do to recognize that Social Security was intended to be a foundation of retirement security? Like a house, you can't live on the foundation, you need to build something on top of it. And so one of the elements of Social Security reform was automatic supplemental savings. It could come through the employer program, it could come through a variety of different vehicles, but the idea that we need to make sure that either through employers or through third-party providers or whatever, that people will have an automatic supplemental savings, defined contribution type, approach, if you will, on top of that. And by the way, I would note that in your survey, people can be a little bit confused between employer and financial services companies, because in many cases the employer is the vehicle to the financial services companies, all right? And I think that those have become so ubiquitous with regard to the options, people understand that better. In many cases, they're thinking about, well, gee, who's got my money and who's investing my money? The employer is more a vehicle to get you there and to provide a certain level of fiduciary oversight, if you will, in that regard.
Yeah, I think some people who analyzed those results made that same that same conclusion,
Right.
and maybe a sort of lack of appreciation for the role that the employer is playing. So, but pursuing that point that you just said a little bit further, what about looking into the future in terms of, the changing nature of the workforce? We'll have a session on that shortly. Demographics, technology. The role of those kinds of things. I know you kind of looked into that a lot when you were at Comptroller General.
Well, let's talk a little bit. One, I talked about the fact the country is very diverse. It's getting more diverse. We've got growing gaps between the haves and the have-nots, including with regard to skills and knowledge. I think we're going to have to re-engineer our entire education system and training system. All right? It used to be that everybody was told you need to go to college. If you get a college degree, you're going to be okay. That's no longer true. All right? Secondly, a bachelor's degree is not a big deal anymore. In addition to that, if you get a college degree, depending upon what your major is, you may not even be able to get a job. And how much money does it cost you? How much do you have in student debt? I think one of the things we have to do is do a much better job of analyzing where are we in the United States as it relates to the global economy? What are our comparative advantages? How do we need to make sure that we do a better job of having business work with the education community to make sure that we're providing the kinds of skills and knowledge that business needs for them to be able to hire people, for us to be able to compete in an increasingly competitive and interconnected global economy? And I think in many cases that means more training with regard to trades, more training with regard to things that don't necessarily require a four-year degree, that quite frankly can be more ubiquitous, provided on a much broader basis and a more cost-effective basis. I think we're also going to move away from bricks and mortar. I mean, my son has a bachelor's degree from Villanova in finance, and my daughter-in-law has a bachelor's degree from Villanova in nursing, but they both have a master's degree from the University of Phoenix in other fields, and that's not a bricks and mortar thing. And so I think there are lots of things that we have to re-examine in light of not just where we are, but where we're headed and what our position in the world is. At the end of World War II, we were over 50% of global GDP. We're now 22% trying to maintain market share, all right? And we are in a global economic Olympics. That is real. And one of the things I get concerned about is that we're mortgaging the future of our kids and grandkids, reducing investments in their future at a time that they're going to have a lot tougher competition.
So on this global thing, any lessons to be learned from other countries that you know?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you one that you wouldn't expect. Sweden. Sweden has socialized medicine cradle to grave. I'm not advocating socialized medicine cradle to grave, just understand that. At the same point in time, they had a huge financial crisis in the 90s, and their finance minister at the time, and subsequently their auditor general is a good friend of mine, they made tough choices. One of the things they did is they recognized you can't write a blank check for health care. It will bankrupt you. This country has written a blank check for health care. That is irresponsible, unsustainable, and we can't do it. And we have to fundamentally re-examine what's the role between the government, division of responsibilities, between the government, between employers, between individuals. And my personal view is, and this may be controversial, I think we need to fundamentally transition Medicare, where Medicare is not broad-based coverage for seniors, which, by the way, have the lowest poverty rate in some studies rather than the highest, and provides a basic and essential care along the lines of what I talked about for everybody. That is something that I think would be a dramatic change that would have to be transitioned to over a 20 to 30 year period, but we need to start thinking outside the box and recognize that we're on an imprudent and unsustainable path. That also, quite frankly, would help employers be able to compete better in an interconnected and global economy.
So you're running for governor of Connecticut. After having held a number of senior posts in the federal government, do you think that at a state level that you can do more for individuals? I mean, are you just sort of closer to the people? Are you sort of given up on the gridlock?
Yeah.
And that's sort of why the focus is really for you, kind of looking at a state level to be engaged again?
Washington is a mess. There's lots of words I could use, but I won't state them publicly. Some of which were used by former Speaker Boehner yesterday when I saw him at the airport, but I won't repeat them publicly. You know, the fact is it has deteriorated dramatically since the first time I came in as part of the Reagan administration in 1983, just dramatically. People wanted to come to Washington, get things done. Now it's just, I believe that, I know that my state is in serious trouble. And 70 to 80% of our financial problem is underfunded pensions, unfunded retiree health care. I believe in the 10th Amendment, you know, states' rights and powers. I believe that they can be a model for experimentation of Petri discs with regard to tax reform, health care reform, welfare reform, a variety of other things. And so my wife and I love the state. We like to stay there. I think I'm uniquely qualified to do what needs to be done at this point in time, and so that's why I'm doing it. And I think you've got more of an ability to get things done as the CEO, which is what the governor is.
So we've got this gridlock issue, but a lot of the gridlock, I think a lot of experts would say, is due to the fact that, you know, we've drawn these congressional districts in such a way that they're solidly Republican or solidly Democratic, and so the most conservative Republican, the most liberal Democrat will win in that district, and the people in the middle of the political spectrum are gone. But it's the governors and the state legislators who draw those lines at both the state level as well as the federal level. So if you're elected governor, what are you going to do about that? I don't know how big a problem it is in Connecticut, but
I believe that we now have a republic, which, as you know, is a representative democracy. It's not a direct democracy. We have a republic that is no longer representative of nor responsive to the general public. We not only have partisan gridlock, we have an ideological divide. Way too many Republicans are too far to the right. Way too many Democrats are too far to the left. A significant majority of the American people are in what I call the sensible center. Center right, center left. They're fiscally responsible, socially moderate. That's one of the reasons I'm one of the founders of No Labels, which is for Republicans, Democrats, unaffiliated, progress over partisanship, results over rhetoric. Here's what we need to do. We need redistricting reform, which maximizes the number of competitive districts consistent with the Voting Rights Act, rather than minimize the number of competitors. We need integrated and open primaries. You can be a Republican, Democrat, unaffiliated. We have one primary. Everybody votes. The top two or ranked voting run off in the general election. We have campaign finance reform. We have lobbying reform, and we have term limits. And I would say for legislators, it should be 12 years, and for executive, it should be 8 years. By the way, we don't have any of those in Connecticut. None of them, all right? And so one of my things that I'm focusing on, in addition to put our finances in order and restoring our competitive posture, is how can we have a more representative and responsive republic? And that can be done at the state level, and I will do it in partnership with the legislature.
We've got time for one more question, Dave. And I think this person is asking for you to expand a little bit, that you shared about the employer role for retirement. Could you say a little bit more about your vision of the future role on health care for employers?
My vision is we need to figure out a way that every American can have basic and essential health care, which is preventative, wellness, catastrophic protection, that is, I would argue, publicly financed, single risk pool, but delivered through choice and competition through the private sector, with a budget focused more on outcomes rather than activities. That leaves a huge opportunity for employers and for others, but in particular employers, to decide what else they want to do in order to attract and retain top talent. I think that clearly they have a role to play there, but right now they're bearing all the burden. They're bearing all the burden, all right? And as a result, we still have segments of society that have nothing, and we still have a lot of cost shifting going on. And I think the Affordable Care Act clearly needs major reform. I think it's probably here to stay, at least in the foreseeable future, but it needs major reform. But I don't think we're having the right debate on health care.
Well, good. Then we'll have you back for a continuation of that next time. And we thank you so much for all that you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Go out that way.